So we've now dropped below 200 meters deep.
For a long time, scientists thought the deep Pacific was boring. Hot rock, old plates, nothing crazy. Then a new set of seismic scans picked up a huge, sharp-edged structure hiding far below the ocean.
Look at this, look at this. I think we found something here. Yeah.
In a place that should be quiet. No one can agree on what is inside it yet. And if this thing really does turn out to be a hollow chamber, it changes everything we think we know about Earth. The strange discovery under the Pacific. Deep under the Pacific Ocean, far below the seafloor, earthquake waves started doing something that did not match the old maps.
A massive earthquake in the far east Pacific Ocean has prompted a tsunami watch for parts of BC.
When a group of scientists in Europe rebuilt a three-dimensional picture of Earth's interior, a huge feature appeared in the mantle beneath the western Pacific. It was a thick body of unusually stiff rock wrapped around a region that behaved differently from the material around it, sitting hundreds of miles down where almost nothing special was supposed to be. To see why that is strange, it helps to know how this picture was made. Every large earthquake sends out pressure waves that squeeze rock and shear waves that shake it side to side. These waves move faster through cold or dense rock and slower through hot or softer rock, and they bend or bounce when they cross from one layer into another. Seismometers around the world record the tiny motions when the waves arrive. By comparing the arrival times at many stations, scientists can work backward and build a three-dimensional image of the inside of the planet, much like a doctor uses many X-ray slices to build a CT scan. For many years, global scans used only the first part of each signal, the moment when the strongest pulse reached a station. That was enough to outline big features such as the solid inner core and the liquid outer core, but it left many parts of the mantle blurry, especially under the wide stretches of the Pacific, where there are few instruments and not many earthquakes. For many years, global scans used only the first part of each signal, the moment when the strongest pulse reached a station. That was enough to outline big features such as the solid inner core and the liquid outer core, but it left many parts of the mantle blurry, especially under the wide stretches of the Pacific, where there are few instruments and not many earthquakes. In 2024, a team led by Thomas Schouten and Andreas Fichtner at ETH Zurich and partner institutes tried a different approach. Instead of using only arrival times, they fed almost the entire wiggle of each earthquake record into a method called full waveform inversion. In simple words, they guessed a starting model of the inside of the Earth, used computers to simulate how waves would move through it, compared those synthetic waves to the real data, and then adjusted the model over and over until the match improved. The end product was a new global model of the lower mantle that revealed a much more detailed and uneven pattern of wave speeds than earlier studies. One of the sharpest surprises lay under the western Pacific. In the new model, a broad zone at depths between about 560 miles and 750 miles showed waves moving faster than average. In seismology, faster waves usually mean rock that is colder, denser, or made from minerals that are harder to deform. Around this fast patch, the waves slowed a bit. The cross-sections looked like a big block or wall of stiff mantle rock surrounding a region that behaved differently from the rest. The place where this block turned up was not where most people expected. In older models, fast areas deep in the mantle were usually found under places where Earth's plates have been sinking for millions of years, like under the Americas or around the Pacific. Because of that, scientists assumed that most fast spots were just old, cold chunks of plate that had sunk deep into the planet over a very long time. But in this case, the new model found a fast patch in a place where Earth's plates have not been sinking. It's far from today's plate edges, and there's no sign in surface rocks that a giant slab ever went down there. In an interview, Andreas Fichtner reached for a medical analogy. He said it was like a doctor who has spent years scanning blood vessels with a simple ultrasound machine and always finds arteries exactly where the textbook says they should be. Then the doctor gets a much sharper scanner and suddenly sees an artery in the middle of the buttock, where no artery is supposed to be. That is how it felt to see this dense block in the middle of the western Pacific mantle. When ETH Zurich reported the result, they tried to explain it in simple language. Their news story and later articles spoke about sunken worlds, or sunken continents, inside the mantle beneath the Pacific, and popular science outlets picked up that wording to talk about hidden structures in a lost world under the ocean floor. On social media, the language drifted even further. Phrases like sunken worlds and hidden structures morphed into terms such as hollow chamber and massive cavity. Simple diagrams that show a ring of fast material around a slower center can look like the walls of a huge room when they are taken out of context. So it is easy for someone with no geophysics background to imagine a giant hollow pocket under the Pacific. So what could this strange deep Earth feature be if it is not a giant empty space? The paper offers a few ideas. One idea is that it might be very old rock that formed more than 4 billion years ago and somehow survived deep in the mantle without getting mixed away. Another idea is that slow movement inside the mantle pushed iron-rich rock into one area, creating a heavy, stiff patch. A third possibility is that this zone is made from old pieces of ocean floor that sank into the mantle a very long time ago, far earlier than the usual 200 million year window scientists often use when they track old plates. And this strange deep feature isn't alone. When scientists zoom out to the base of the mantle, they see that it is part of a much larger system that circles the Pacific on an almost unimaginable scale. The massive deep continent under the Pacific. Near the very base of Earth's rocky layer, right above the metal core, the ground is shaped into huge deep hills and plateaus. On the Pacific side of the planet, that deep landscape is so massive and so different from normal mantle rock that many Earth scientists now compare it to a buried continent under the ocean. The biggest feature there is a thick, heavy body of rock that sits directly on top of the outer core. There is one like it under the Pacific Ocean and another under Africa. Scientists call them large, low shear velocity provinces, but it is easier here to think of them as giant deep blobs. Earthquake maps show that each blob stretches sideways for thousands of miles and rises roughly 500 to a little over 600 miles above the core, more than 100 times taller than Mount Everest. The Pacific blob is the one we're interested in. It takes up a huge area above the core on that side of the planet, with a rough, uneven top and sharp edges along its sides. Inside it, earthquake waves move more slowly than they do in normal mantle rock, which tells scientists that the material there is hotter or made from different minerals. Other studies that look at how Earth's deep interior tugs on tides suggest that this blob is actually a little denser than the surrounding mantle, so it behaves like a heavy, deep continent of rock sitting at the bottom of the Pacific mantle. For years, no one could agree on what this deep continent was made of. One idea was that it might contain very old material left over from the early Earth, when a Mars-sized object hit our planet and helped create the Moon. In that view, some of the unusual rock from that event sank and gathered on top of the core. Another idea said you don't need anything special. The blob could simply be made from old ocean crust that sank downward over hundreds of millions of years and slowly built up near the core. In 2025, a team led by James Panton tested these ideas with new computer models. They used supercomputers to track slow mantle flow and plate motion over about 1 billion years, then compared the results with what we see deep inside Earth today. Their work showed that both deep blobs can form naturally from recycled seafloor that has been pushed down into the mantle over time. They also found that the two blobs are not made the same way. The one under Africa looks older and more mixed. The Pacific blob contains much more fresh ocean crust, about 1/2 more recycled seafloor than the African one. That extra amount of dense crust makes the Pacific deep continent heavier, more compact, and more sharply outlined. The main reason goes back to the long history of the Pacific Ocean. For hundreds of millions of years, the edges of this basin have been lined with deep trenches, where ocean plates bend and slide down into the mantle. Each time a plate dives, it drags cold, heavy seafloor into the deep earth. Some of that rock stalls at the middle depths. Some keep sinking all the way to the base of the mantle and then spread out along the top of the core. Over very long spans of time, this steady rain of seafloor has fed the Pacific blob with layer after layer of dense material, while the African side, with fewer of these sinking zones, has stayed lighter and more spread out. Inside the Pacific blob, the story is not simple either. Older global maps showed it as one smooth, featureless lump of slow rock. Newer studies that track tiny shifts in the timing and strength of earthquake waves show that the blob has harder patches inside it. In some areas, the waves speed up again, which means those parts are denser and stiffer than the rest. The new picture looks less like a single soft blob, and more like a vast, deep room with thick inner walls and ridges. The slower, hotter material fills the spaces between those walls. The faster, denser slabs act like pillars that brace the structure from within. Around the outside of the blob lies what many researchers now call a slab graveyard. When an ocean plate sinks down at a trench, it starts as a long, thin sheet of cold rock sliding under another plate. As it drops deeper, it bends, breaks, and changes shape. Many of these slabs seem to collect against the sides of the deep blobs or spread out over the core just beyond their edges. Seismic studies under the North Pacific and other regions have found wide bands of very fast, dense material at the base of the mantle that line up with where old plates should have ended up. Those bands mark places where many generations of seafloor have been buried on top of each other and squeezed into a thick pile. This graveyard is not just a quiet dumping ground. When slabs stack up and press against the sides of the blob, they help steer how deep rock moves. Models of slow movement under the North Pacific show that sinking plates act like giant paddles, pushing deep rock around. They shove softer mantle toward the blob's walls and gather tiny, extra-slow patches at its edges. In simple terms, cold plates sliding down from above keep stirring the deep rock and help keep the sides of the chamber under the Pacific sharp and well-shaped. Not all of the dead plates reach the bottom. Some get stuck halfway down in the middle layer of the mantle. In 2024, a team at the University of Maryland found evidence of an old piece of seafloor that stopped there under the southeastern Pacific. They were studying a zone called the Mantle Transition Zone, a band between roughly 250 and about 410 miles deep, where the main mantle minerals switch form under pressure. By watching how earthquake waves bounce through this layer, they saw that the transition zone was much thicker than normal over a wide area. The best explanation was a block of cold, heavy rock left from a plate that started sinking about 250 million years ago, but never made the full trip. That stranded slab is only one example, but it shows how layered the deep Pacific really is. To deep Earth scientists, this whole structure is not just a weird shape. It is a kind of filing cabinet for the planet's past. Each sunken plate in that graveyard started as a real ocean on the surface, with its own ridges, islands, and coastlines. When those oceans closed and their floors sank, pieces of them stayed frozen in the mantle. Teams working on projects like the Atlas of the Underworld now match those deep slabs to vanished oceans with names like Panthalassa and ancient Pacific plates that no longer exist at the surface. In a way, the chamber under the Pacific still holds the ghost of an ocean that once wrapped almost all the way around the globe. This is also where the story links up with the rise and breakup of supercontinents. When the last great supercontinent, Pangaea, began to split apart, enormous lava outbursts tore open the crust in places like what is now the Central Atlantic and parts of Africa and North America. Several studies have noticed that many of those ancient flood basalt regions sit almost directly above the sharp edges of the deep blobs, especially along the African side. Other work has proposed a simple test. If you take a proposed map of where Pangaea once sat and line it up over today's deep blobs, the best reconstructions tend to put the thickest lava piles above the margins of those deep structures, not at random spots. That suggests the blobs have been sitting in roughly the same places for hundreds of millions of years, acting like anchor points in the mantle, while continents drift around above them. The Pacific blob seems to play a similar long-term role on the other side of the planet. It sits where the floor of an ancient ocean once sank for a very long time, and it still feeds strong upwellings at its edges. Some of the largest volcanic plateaus on the seafloor, such as the Yontong Java region in the southwest Pacific, line up with where deep plumes are thought to have risen off the edge of this blob in the distant past. Those huge lava events are long over, but the deep structure that helped drive them is still there. All of that deep rock and all of those buried plates do not just sit there. Together, they help power the fiery belt of earthquakes and volcanoes that wraps around the Pacific. How the deep Pacific powers the Ring of Fire. The Pacific Ring of Fire is a belt of coasts where almost 90% of the world's earthquakes and about 3/4 of active volcanoes take place. It runs past Japan, Alaska, the west coasts of North and South America, and down toward New Zealand. Around this ring, the outer shell of the planet is broken into large plates. In many places, an ocean plate slowly dives underneath a continent or another ocean plate. That kind of boundary is called a subduction zone. The top of the plate carries rock, mud, and a huge amount of water. Over time, it bends, breaks, and then sinks thousands of miles down. At the surface, that slow dive is what sets up the most powerful earthquakes and tsunamis on Earth. One recent example is the 2011 earthquake off the northeast coast of Japan. Seismologists measured it at around magnitude 9.0 to 9.1. It pushed the seafloor upward and drove a tsunami that in some places reached more than 130 feet high and killed over 18,000 people. That kind of event fits a familiar pattern. The Great Chilean Earthquake in 1960, the Big Alaska Quake in 1964, and the 2004 Indian Ocean Earthquake off Sumatra all had magnitudes above 9 and produced huge tsunamis. Almost every one of the largest quakes on record is a subduction quake tied to this same system of sinking plates. Deep inside the planet, those plates do not stop a few hundred miles down. Seismic images show that many slabs keep sinking far into the mantle and end up stacked in the deep interior, some near the boundary between the mantle and the core. Under the Pacific, many of those sunken plates pile up around the huge, dense structure that seismic studies have mapped there. Over very long times, the same plates that tear cities apart at the surface become part of the deep chamber below. The connection also runs upward. Near the edges of that deep structure, hot material rises in narrow columns called mantle plumes. A mantle plume is a pipe-shaped rise of hotter rock that is less dense than the rock around it, so it slowly floats upward and can melt near the surface. Hawaii is the easiest place to see how all of this works. The Hawaiian Islands sit far from any major plate boundary, yet they are some of the most active volcanoes on Earth. A deep plume, basically a tower of hot rock rising from near the base of the mantle, sits under the islands. As the Pacific Plate slowly moves over this fixed hotspot, it leaves behind a chain of volcanoes that get older the farther you go from the Big Island. Studies that trace these plumes downward suggest that many of them connect back to the edges of the huge slow zones at the bottom of the mantle, especially the ones under the Pacific and Africa. In simple terms, the walls of the deep chamber act like launch pads for giant columns of hot rock that build islands and undersea plateaus at the surface. Now add water to that picture. Around the edges of the Pacific Plate, the zones where plates dive downward don't just drag rock into the earth, they drag water too. Some of that water sits in mud on the seafloor, and some is locked inside the minerals of the ocean crust itself. When the plate bends and begins its dive, it carries all of that water with it. You can see this clearly off the east coast of New Zealand's North Island, at the Hikurangi subduction zone. There, the Pacific Plate slides under the Australian Plate. This area is known for slow earthquakes, where parts of the fault slip quietly for days or months instead of snapping in an instant. In 2023, a team from the University of Texas and its partners used three-dimensional seismic images to look below that boundary. They found a buried volcanic plateau about 2 miles under the seafloor, wrapped in thick layers of sediment. Those rocks were loaded with water, so much that the team described it as a hidden sea's worth of water, trapped inside the crust instead of sitting as a liquid ocean. That trapped water changes how the fault behaves. As the sinking plate gets squeezed, some of the water leaks upward into the boundary between the plates. High pressure from this water makes it easier for the rocks to slide. In some areas, this may help the fault release stress gently in slow earthquakes. In other places, it might help trigger sudden, violent quakes. The same fluids can also rise into the plate above, melting rock and feeding future volcanoes. The biggest hidden water story sits far deeper. Plates sinking around the Ring of Fire carry water into a zone between the upper and lower mantle, roughly 250 to about 410 miles deep. Geophysicists call this the mantle transition zone. Here, the common mantle mineral olivine changes into a high-pressure form called ringwoodite, and ringwoodite can hold a remarkable amount of water inside its crystal structure. It doesn't look wet, but it can store a huge amount by weight compared with the dry mantle above. Rare diamonds give direct proof of this. Some diamonds formed in this zone contain tiny grains of ringwoodite packed with water. Lab tests and seismic work together suggest that the transition zone could hold 1, 2, or even 3 times the amount of water found in all the oceans on the surface, except it is locked inside minerals, not sitting as liquid. Seismic studies under parts of the Northwest Pacific add yet another clue. Researchers found a broad layer where earthquake waves slow down just above 255 miles deep. The simplest explanation is that rising material from deeper in the mantle is starting to melt here because it carries more water than the overlying rocks can hold. Even a tiny bit of melt slows the waves. This low-velocity layer is more evidence that the transition zone beneath the Pacific is not dry rock. It is a long-term water reservoir tied to both sinking slabs and the deeper chamber. Put all of this together, and it becomes clear that the picture under the Pacific is far more complex than a simple hollow. At the top, the Ring of Fire marks where plates dive into the Earth and where giant earthquakes and arc volcanoes sit. Beneath that, plates keep sinking and deliver water into the transition zone. Deeper down, the Pacific mantle holds a huge, hot structure and piles of old slabs that shape where plumes rise. In between, hidden layers of wet rock and partially melted material act like valves that control how water, heat, and stress move through the system. This deep plumbing can't tell anyone the exact day or year of the next big quake, but it does show that the violence along the Pacific Rim is connected to enormous structures far below the seafloor, and to water that never reaches the surface. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.